I thought because we were at the Thomas S. Monson Center here on this block, that how appropriate to have an opportunity to talk about President Monson. I remember when I was first working on his biography, I asked him one day, President, what should I call you? Do I call you president? Do I call you elder? Do I call you prophet? What do I call you? And he looked at me and he said, well, most people call me Tom. And I looked at him and I said, I can't call you Tom. So I called him President Monson. So it's fun to be in a place to have the reminder of the significance of his life. I think putting him on South Temple with that name out in front, lined up with all the people that had an influence on the growth of this state, it's not only appropriate, but it's heartwarming. I thought I'd begin by just sharing with you a little of his background that connects to the pioneers. You know, President Monson loved to describe pioneers as those who go before, showing others the way to follow. And I think the Sons of the Utah Pioneers have done a great job as an organization of helping preserve that picture of not only those who went before, but those who have followed. Here's what he says about his heritage. He says, I can say as Nephi of old, that I was born of goodly parents, whose own parents and grandparents were gathered out of the lands of Sweden and Scotland and England by dedicated missionaries. After joining the church, these noble men, women, and children made their way to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. Many were the trials and heartaches they encountered along the way. They came to a new nation, a strange language, and a people whom they did not know. But God they did know. And more important, he knew them and blessed them and prospered them and has been with them. So you can say about Thomas Monson that he never left those moorings. He always had such great respect for his family in England, his family in Scotland, and his family in Sweden. It was the Monson line that came out of Sweden. It was the Condi line that came out of England. So he had this presence of being a believer and coming from a long line of believers. I didn't know President Monson when he asked me to write his biography. In fact, Jeff and I were in England at the time. And we got a phone call one Wednesday night. We were home. I was getting ready for a district meeting the next day with missionaries. And what I always did was make them chocolate chip cookies because they were homemade and they reminded so many of them of home. And those who were from England and Africa and Europe learned to gain a great appreciation for chocolate chip cookies, though they weren't raised on them. You couldn't even buy chocolate chips in England. You had to buy a big bar of chocolate and then with your meat cleaver, chop up the chocolate to make your own chocolate chips. Well, I was in the kitchen and I'm making cookies and the phone rings. Well, I didn't even pay any attention to it. Didn't even have a phone in the kitchen because the phone was never for me. And Jeff answered the phone. He was in the office and he came in and I still remember him coming in and standing in the middle of the kitchen, arms down at his side with a very sober expression on his face. And he said, the phone's for you. And I thought to myself, well, that can only mean one thing. Some missionary has gotten a letter from his used-to-be girlfriend, and he wants me to put him back together again. Or better yet, I even had one missionary ask me to call her and try and talk her out of it. I said, no, elder, trust me. This is a good thing. Just move on with your life. So he says, the phone's for you. And I looked at him and I said, okay. And he said, it's President Monson. Now, this was only shortly after President Hinckley had died, and President Monson had been sustained at April conference, and this was in June. And he said, it's President Monson, and he wants to talk to you. And I looked at him and I said, what missionary thinks that's a funny joke, that he's pretending to be President Monson? He said, no, Heidi, it is President Monson, and he wants to talk to you. Well, now as a writer, immediately I thought, what have I written that has crossed his desk and he's not happy about it? So unhappy that he has called me in the mission field, and I could just see my temple recommend flying out the door, or who knows what else. So I went into the office and we had two phones. I picked up one phone, and my husband, being the curious soul that he is, picked up the other. And I said, hello, great trepidation in my voice. And he said, you know, that you can hear that voice even today. You can hear his voice over the pulpit. Heidi, how are you? And I thought to myself, I don't know how I am. You tell me, how am I? And he said, how's jolly old England? And then for the next 15 minutes, it's as if he took one of these chairs and just sat down and scooted up to the table and looked at me and said, how are things going? And he asked me, how's the mission? Where are your missionaries from? Are they using Preach My Gospel? Are you enjoying working with the stake leaders? What have you found to be successful? How are your kids at home? How's your mother doing? I know you were worried about leaving her. On and on and on. And I had this wonderful conversation with him, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, is this what the president of the church does on Wednesday afternoon? He calls up mission presidents' wives and scares them to death. Well, after about a half an hour of this discussion going back and forth, and I didn't know President Monson. It wasn't like I was on speed dial. He had called us to serve our mission. And my husband and I had had a couple of experiences with him prior to that, but I wasn't on a first name basis as I saw it. So finally he pauses and he says, Heidi, I've been getting a lot of pressure to have a biography written. And I thought, well, that makes sense, because good heavens, you, the president of the church, people want to know where you came from, what you learned along the way, what you're bringing to this responsibility as prophet, seer, and revelator that they can identify with, that they can hold on to, and that will make a difference in their lives as they listen to your teachings. And I said, okay, well, that makes sense. And I even thought to myself, I think I know who would write that, because I know a lot of the people that do those things in the church. And I kind of pictured someone I thought maybe would do that. And he said, and Deseret Book has given me a list of people they think that could write it. And he said, and I've gone over that list with Francis. He said, but you know, I took it to the Lord. And I want you to write my biography. I thought to myself, this is so great. I'll get home from England, and here I am on this pause of 3 years, not doing any writing, but I'll get home from England and have something I can write. And he said, now you're not that busy, are you? And I said, well, if you don't think I'm busy, I'm not busy. And he said, okay, good, because I want you to get started tomorrow, and you'll be halfway done by the time you get home. I thought, I'm in England. I didn't say that, but he said, now I know you're in England. And I thought, oh, good heavens, he can read my mind. And he's thousands of miles away. And he said, but we'll do what we can to help you. And so I did what he said. I got started the next morning, and they sent me stacks of his talks. I said, just before I served, we went on our mission. I had served on these committees to write the manuals for presidents of the church. And you can remember those, Harold B. Lee and Brigham Young and Joseph F. Smith and Joseph Smith. And what we did was we took their messages, their talks, what they'd written, and we worked from that. So that was where I was coming from. So I said to him, if you could send me a copy of every talk that you've got on file. Now, I know there are a lot that you don't have on file, but if there are some, or even notes that you have, that would be very helpful for me. And he said, I'll have the office send that off to you. And then I called his secretary and he said, call Lynn and have her set up an appointment where we can talk. We can do video conferencing. You in England, me here. So I called and set that up with her. And she said, how much time do you think you'll need? And I thought, well, a good interview is 45 minutes so that you can get into something but not wear them out. So I said 45 minutes. And there was this long pause. And she said, oh. And I thought, oh my, I've asked for too much time. And before I could say anything else, she said, you know, you're going to need more than that. I'm going to put you down for 2 hours, but plan on 3. Okay. So on Wednesday evenings, the church set up this big system in the mission office for us. On Wednesday evenings, we talked to President Monson on this big, huge screen, and he had a video camera of us, and he talked to us on a screen, and we chatted. And so for the first year that I worked on it, before we came home, I gained most of my information and experience from talking to him personally for 3 hours on Wednesday evenings, and from reading his talks. And what I came to understand was that I kind of expected that President Monson would be different in his messages than in his personal conversation, because a lot of the apostles are a little more formal at the pulpit than they are when they're talking, or vice versa. They're a little more conversant and forthcoming at the pulpit, and a little more reserved when you meet with them individually. Didn't know for sure where that would come across. He is exactly the same when he talks at the pulpit as when he talks to you individually. You know, you can just see him. I remember him getting up right after a speaker. Here he was in the first presidency at the time, and Elder Hales had been sick for several years. You may remember that. And he was hardly ever at conference. And he got up, and before he began his message, he looked over to where Elder Hales was sitting on the left, and he said, Bob, it's good to see you here. We're glad to have you back. That's the way he is. That's the way he was when he was speaking, and that's the way he was when he was talking individually. Like I said, I didn't know him well. I asked him one day, President, how did you really pick me out of how did you come to decide I should write this? I said, I was not on your speed dial, and I was not one of your close associates or friends. And he looked at me and he said, I have 14 million friends in this world, and you are one of them. Okay, so you can see how he views, and how even today, because you know that he's having influence in what's going on, but you can see how he views the members of the church. In talking to the Bishop Burton, who at the time was the presiding bishop, I said, how would you describe President Monson? And he said, President Monson is the bishop of the whole church. If he could sit down individually with every member of the church once a year and see how they're doing, that would be for him the epitome of his best experience. I asked him one day, if you could go back in time and choose one experience that you had as a leader in the church, what would it be? What would you choose to do? And he looked at me and he said, I'd go back to being a bishop. He was the bishop of 185 people in a West Side ward.
11.
What?
11.
Oh, 1,100. Did I say 100? That's why I bring my husband. He's so good at numbers. And I'm not. 1,185 people, 80 of them are widows. And he lived on the west side of town, right by the railroad tracks. So when a train would come roaring down the street, we don't have that so much anymore. But at the time, a train, when he was a young boy, come roaring down the street. After it passed by, his mother would get up and straighten the pictures in the living room. It was not an affluent area, but it was an area of really good people, and he loved them. And so when he talked in conference about the widows in his ward, these were not just names on the roll who never came. These were people that he visited, that he spoke at their funerals. Every funeral of all 85 women, he spoke at the funeral. Sometimes he didn't even know that they died, but he got home from an assignment somewhere in the world and found out that he had a funeral that day. And he was there to speak as he had promised he would be. That's the kind of man Thomas S. Monson was. When I got home from the mission, I was indeed halfway through. Like he said, you'll be halfway through by the time you get home. And I was. I was halfway through his book. I'd gotten him all the way up to when he became an apostle. And then I began the process of tracking his life as he served as an apostle from 1963 to 2018. The last years of his life as the senior apostle, the president of the church, prophet, seer, and revelator. Well, in those early days, when he was just a young bishop, he was called one day on the phone by a young man who lived in his ward. If there's one experience in President Monson's life that he would tell you shaped his direction, his commitment, his dedication, his understanding of his responsibility as a disciple of Jesus Christ, this would be the one he would turn to. And you perhaps heard him tell this story. Here he is, a young bishop. He gets a phone call from a young man in his ward who's living with an uncle. And the young man says to him, now, President Monson, was a printer, worked at Deseret Press. The young man says, they've taken my uncle to the hospital. He's gravely ill. And the last thing he said before he left was call the bishop and tell him I need to see him immediately. And he said, so I'm calling to see if you can go and see my uncle. And Bishop Monson said, well, of course, I'll go tonight. And he said, oh, thank you so much. But before he could go to the meeting, he had to go to a stake meeting, first stake meeting as a young bishop. He goes and they have them in the Temple View stake, which has now been consolidated with others, but they had them sit on the stand. So he's got all these bishops lined up on the stand, and Bishop Monson is one of them. The meeting begins, and the stake president is up giving his message, and into President Monson's mind and into his heart come words. These words, get up right now and go to the hospital. And he looked around, and he'd had that happen before, but not sitting in a stake meeting being told to get up and walk out in front of everybody and thinking to himself, what would people think if I walked out in front of all of the messages, particularly the one given by the stake president? And he stayed in his seat. The next speaker got up and began to talk. And the voice came again. Get up right now and go to the hospital. And he sat there for a minute, looking around like I'm looking at all of you. And he stayed in his seat. The peer pressure, the concern about how it would be viewed. Not until the closing song was being sung, and it probably wasn't Do What Is Right, but as the closing song was being sung, he got out of his seat, bolted down the aisle, out the door, into his car, and raced up the hill to the hospital. He ran into the hospital, got the room number, was on the third floor, didn't wait for the elevator. He's 22 years old. He races up the stairs, runs down the hall, and he sees a very prim and proper nurse standing outside a door. Remember those days? White dress, little white cap. And he stops and looks at her and looks at the room. It was the right room. And the nurse says to him, you must be Bishop Monson. And he said, I am. And then she looked at him and her shoulders kind of slumped. She had this expression of kind of sadness on her face. And she said, pointing to the man in the room, he was calling for you right before he died. President Monson will tell you that lesson was not lost on me. Never again he committed to the Lord. Never again, no matter what his service or his call, would he let a prompting go by and not act immediately. Never again. I love his thought. That lesson was not lost on me, because time and again, as we were talking video conferencing, and then when we got back from England, I went to work in his office, and I had a desk, and I kind of had an opportunity to talk to him several times, many times during the day. And over, as he was telling me a story that taught a principle of inspiration or revelation, or a principle of living a commandment, he would always conclude it by saying, that lesson was not lost on me. Let me give you another example. When we finished our mission, we had the opportunity to go to East Germany. Now, many of you know that President Monson was in charge of all the countries behind the Berlin Wall for years and years. He was in charge of East Germany and all those countries. And the first time that he went to East Germany, he called up Francis. Before he called Francis, he called the State Department. And he said who he was, and that he was going to East Germany on behalf of the church, and that he wanted to know what he needed to take with him and what hoops he needed to jump. And the man from the State Department, the desk responsible for East Germany, said, don't go. He said, we don't have any relations with any of those countries that we could in any way step in and help you. If anything happened, we couldn't get you out. Don't go. Well, he went home and told Frances what the man had said, and she looked at him and she said, well, you're not going to go, are you? And he said, well, of course I'm going to go. The Lord asked me to go, I'm going. And she said, well, I'm not going with you, because if you don't come back, someone's got to be here to raise the children. So he did go. Time and time again he went, so many times that he quit counting, and so did the saints in Germany. If there was one period of his life that spoke of the very essence of his ministry, it was the time he spent in East Germany and the surrounding countries that were closed off from the world. The first time he went to church when he was in East Germany, he walked into a building. We've been there. We had the opportunity to go with a man named Henry Burkhardt, who became one of the leaders of the church in East Germany, and who worked very closely with President Monson for years and years. Well, Henry took us to this old, run-down, dilapidated factory building where the windows had been blown out during the war and had never been replaced. And you went in and you went up some very steep stairs to where there were offices on the second floor, the factory being on the main floor. So we went up these very steep stairs to a room a little bigger than this. Hardwood floor, not in good condition, no windows, at least not most windows. Chairs, a few chairs, but none of them matched. And some of them didn't have 4 legs. Some of them only had 3. Some benches. This was the setting where these people met to worship the Lord Jesus Christ for years and years. This was their church in their area. Well, he took us up there and we went up on the stand, which was just an elevated set of planks with a small little pulpit. The pulpit was still there. And he said, the first time Thomas Monson walked into this building, he came in, he walked up to the front, he sat down. No one knew who he was because they hadn't seen any pictures or any information about the church. This was after the wall had gone up. So they didn't know who the apostles were by the way they looked. Well, he got up and started to talk, and then they knew who he was. They could feel that this man was sent from God, and they were his people. So time and time again, he spent time with the people in Germany. At one point, he and Henry Burkhardt and a handful of others went up on a hillside over Dresden, and he gave a prayer for the land. He didn't dedicate it because the government wouldn't allow that. The church never does anything that could in any way compromise their ability to go forward in a country. So he prayed for the land. He prayed for the people who were members of the church. He prayed for the government leaders that they would give them space to practice their religion. And then he prayed and asked that someday there would be missionaries there. He prayed and asked that there would be all the blessings that the Lord has for his people on the earth given to those people who were sequestered in that foreign godless land. Well, asking that there would be missionaries, he prayed they would have buildings because he knew he'd been to their buildings. He knew what they needed. They needed chapels. He prayed that that would happen. That night he went back to his hotel, which was very, it was not a good place. And there were bed bugs, and there wasn't a blanket, but there was a flag with a swastika still on the wall. And he knelt down by the side of his bed and he wept to the Lord that he had promised these people that there would be all the blessings. And how would that ever happen? And then he left it in the Lord's hands. Well, by the end of his ministry, when he was called into the first presidency, no longer an apostle in the Quorum of the 12, by the end of that period of his ministry, he was in Freiburg, Germany, where the temple was dedicated to the Lord Jesus Christ. And then the wall came down. Now, he'd met with all kinds of government officials with Henry Burkhardt, and he had talked with government officials for years and years. And when they began the process of asking if they could buy land, no was the answer. Could they buy a building? No was the answer. They wanted to build a temple. And finally, these German leaders said, "We know you. We've watched you for more than 20 years. We will give you the land to build your building, but all the materials have to be bought here. All the work has to be done by people here." They agreed to all of that, and a temple was completed and dedicated for those saints so they could receive all the blessings. They agreed to allow missionaries into the country and missionaries going out of the country. And Henry Burkhardt just sat at that table with President Monson, more than amazed at the hand of the Lord in the lives of those people. But when we were in East Germany, being shown around by Henry Burkhardt, I said to him, "What was the experience?" He speaks pretty good English. "What was the one experience that epitomized for you the impact of Thomas Monson on the saints behind the Iron Curtain? What was the one time that you said to yourself, he is indeed an apostle of God?" And I'm expecting him to say, "Oh, it's when we sat down with the Chancellor of East Germany. Oh, it was when we had the temple dedicated. Oh, it was when the first missionaries left the land." That's not what he said. What he said was so indicative of a Thomas Monson. He said, "I sent him a letter telling him about my wife who was in the hospital. She'd been in the hospital 9 weeks. She'd had surgery on her gallbladder and the surgery had gone wrong. And now she had pneumonia and we didn't think she was going to live." He said he got that letter. He got on a plane that afternoon and came to East Germany, notified me that he was here, and I picked him up. We went straight to the airport. Straight to the hospital to see Inga. She was on the third floor. He said he went in and with me laid hands on her head and gave her a blessing as an apostle of God and commanded her to get well. He said, then we left the hospital. He asked me to gather some of the people who were available that we could meet and have a gathering together, that he could bless their lives with his love for them and the love of the brethren for all of them. And these straggly men came in, some of them in suits that had been given to them by President Monson or shoes that had been given to them. He recognized most of the ties that he had given them. He met with them and then went and got on a plane and came home. He said that was the ministry of Thomas S. Monson. He said he blessed by Inga and she lived. I loved that story. I loved it because it was the essence of Thomas Monson. When I got home from England and I was working in his office, as I said, I had the opportunity to read all of his journals. He kept a journal, an official journal, every day, the entire time he served from 1963 to 2018. Single-spaced, double-sided, a book for every year, and every book was about this thick. And I read through those journals. I remember calling Robert Hales, who we were very close to, when we were in the mission field, and telling him of what President Monson had asked me to write this biography, and did he have any counsel for me? And he said, just work on his early years. He said, and when you get home, you've got all of his journals that will be his entire ministry in the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency. He said, it'll all be in there. So I expected, as a historian, that I was going to find the journals of Wilford Woodruff, that I was going to find this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, that I was going to find the date, the time, and the place when correlation and curriculum were established, and when we went from these many missions to these many missions, when he was the head of the missionary department, and when he was the head of the priesthood department, when they established this program and this program. And I expected all of that to fall in line, and that would develop the story of him as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. I was surprised, because as I began to read those journals, day after day and entry after entry, I found his description of meeting with so-and-so and stopping to talk to so-and-so and attending the funeral of so-and-so and seeing this experience. And oh, this touched my heart, and here's what I learned. And his was not a history of the development of the church. His was a history of developing disciples of Jesus Christ. And page after page, there were accounts where he told, here's one for an example. He went one day down to a gas station to put gas in his car. This was before they had people driving him around. And he went into, it was Holiday Oil on Highland Drive. You might know where that is. He goes in, he puts in his gas, he goes inside to pay, always paid in cash, reaches in his pocket and brings out the money, puts it down on the counter. The young man who was in charge of the cash at that day, cash register, comes walking over to the counter like that. He's got his hair in dreadlocks. He's got things coming out of his ears and out of his nose. He's got things hanging off of his eyebrows. He's got a scruffy beard. He's got on a dirty t-shirt. You can picture it. And President Monson looks at him and in that cheerful manner says to him, "You getting ready to go on a mission?" Well, the young man looks at him like, "Who are you?" Takes the money, counts it out, slides the money across the table, says nothing. And President Monson says, well, it's been nice being with you today. And good luck to you. And he goes out and gets in his car and drives home. He writes about this in his journal. So I'm upstairs going through what we call File 5. File 5 is a bank of filing cabinets, each row, each drawer filled to the brim with letters to people from President Monson. And I happened on the letter from a missionary to President Monson. And the young man says, I remember when you came in the gas station and you asked me if I was getting ready to go on a mission. He said, let me tell you the story. So this young man had gone home. Did he get down on his knees and pray about going on a mission? Absolutely not. Did he even think about it? Didn't even cross his mind. One day he's walking through the living room and his parents are watching television like this. And the young man kind of looks at him and sits down and, oh my goodness. On the screen was the man from the gas station. And he recognized him. And he sat down, decided to listen to what he had to say. And he was talking about missionaries and serving a mission. And the young man sat through the whole talk. And you can imagine his parents, don't look at him, don't pay attention. He's watching General Conference, just pretend like it's normal. He hadn't done anything like that in years. Well, when President Monson finished speaking, this young man got up and walked out of his room, went into the bedroom, kneeled down by the side of his bed, and started to pray. Something had touched his heart as he had watched the man from the gas station speaking in General Conference. And he said to the Lord, I haven't done this for a really long time, and so I don't know how to do it. But I need to talk about going on a mission. So here in the mission field in New Mexico, this young man is writing the end of the story to President Monson. Those are the experiences of a man of God. President Monson likes to always say, and I always put him in the present tense because I kind of feel like he's still here. The happiest moment in all of mortality is to know that Jesus Christ will call on you if he has a need, and you will go. Do we feel that? Do we turn our lives over to the Lord like that? Thomas Monson did that from the day in the hospital, and he never compromised on that lesson. He learned it, and then he lived it. He lived it time and time again. With the boy in the gas station, with the man at the hospital, he learned it over and over again and shared it. And there were accounts day after day after day of stopping to see so-and-so, sitting with David Freed, you might have known him, right before he died, giving him a blessing to release him and let him go, and then sitting and holding his hand as he died. That's what he wrote about in his journals. He wasn't Wilford Woodruff. He was Thomas Monson. He was the essence of the program that unfolded just after he died, the program of ministering to one another. He was always going to the rescue. One of my favorite stories is one that happened while I was working in his office. He was out at a meeting in the south part of the valley, and he was driving back. He had a driver, Tracy. They were driving back. They always drove up the west side of town because he liked to just pick out things that reminded him of his early years and notice those things that had changed. So they're driving along this one street, houses on both sides, small, modest little homes. And all of a sudden he says, Tracy, stop the car. Tracy pulls over and stops the car. Before Tracy can even get out and open the door, Thomas Monson is out the door, across the street, opening a little chain link fence gate and up to the door, knocked on the door. And Tracy kind of hustling along behind him. And pretty soon the door opens. And this woman is standing there. She's just this little teeny lady. And, he's 6'3" and robust and all energy, full of the Spirit of God. And this little woman looks up at him and she goes, oh, you came. And he looks at her and he says, how was it today? I haven't seen years. And she looks at him and she says, well, today's my birthday. And nobody's come and nobody's called till you. He said, well, we're going to sing you happy birthday. So he looks at Tracy, and the two of them sing happy birthday to her. Then she says, well, how nice of you to stop by, expecting that now he's going to turn around and leave. He says, oh, I've got some time. Can I come in? We can just chat. So in he goes into this little house, and out comes the chair by the table, and he sits down like he has hundreds and hundreds of times with people across the valley and across the church, and starts to chat. They'd gone to school together. They'd known each other. They knew the same people. They chatted for quite a while. And then he said, well, I've got to get to some meetings. And he got up and left. And he and Tracy start back. Now, if it had been most of us, we would have, President, how did you know it was her birthday? Tracy asked him. And he says, I didn't know it was her birthday. He said, I just heard the voice say to me, you know who lives in that house. He said, what that said to me was, you better stop the car and go see him. So he said, that's why I said, stop the car. Now, for most of us, yeah, I know who lives in that house. I remember them, and we keep driving through the next light and the next and off to our meeting, and we'd dismiss the prompting. Not Thomas Monson. Her ministering sisters hadn't come. Home teachers hadn't come. Nieces, nephews, cousins, sisters, members of the ward. No one had called and no one had come. And she'd prayed to her Father in heaven not to be alone. And who did he look around? He goes, let's see, who have I got down there that I can get to? Oh, there's Tommy Monson. I'll just tell him, you know who lives in that house. Because what did he know? That the greatest experience in all of mortality is to know the Lord can call on you and you will go. So again, the question, if you cycle back in your own life, are there those memories? Nobody's come and nobody's called but you. That's the spirit of the apostleship of Thomas S. Monson. When I interviewed President Boyd K. Packer, I said to him, if you were to introduce President Monson to a group that didn't know him, if you were to say things about Thomas Monson, what would you say? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, I would say Thomas Monson is the best man I've ever known. That's it. That's all you need to say. He said, he's the best man I've ever known. And then he called me on the phone a few hours later and he said, I thought of something else. I wouldn't say this in an introduction, but I ought to tell you this story. And I said, okay. And he said, you know, we sat by each other in the quorum for a dozen years. Not quite that many, but 8 years. And he said, and one day he leaned over to me looking up at the clock just as conference was about to begin, a couple of minutes to 10. And he said, Boyd, in 10 minutes, duck hunting season opens and we're here. Because he was real. He was very real. but he was teachable. He went duck hunting on a Sunday morning, newly married, living in the same ward he grew up in. He was with his brother. They had a boat that they tucked under some trees or brush or something. They got their boat out and they're pushing it across the sand hills up by Brigham City. And, they're up and down and up and down. And he's pushing it up and then it goes down. And he was at the back. And he had his rifle with him, or is that what it would be, a rifle? A shotgun. I don't know the difference. Anyway, he has his shotgun with him. And he pushes it up and then he pushes it down and the shotgun goes off and whizzes just past the shoulder of his brother Bob, who's in front. He nearly killed him. He sat down, he looked at Bob and he said, "Bob, we're going home and we're not coming back on Sunday." He went home. 2 weeks later, he was called as the bishop of the ward. The Lord needed to see if he'd learned that lesson. And what did he say after he told me that story? I said, "Can I put that in the book?" And he said, "Oh, for sure, it happened. That's what made me." And I said, "Okay." He said, "That lesson was not lost on me." And I thought, yeah, I know that lesson was not lost on me. Well, he's an amazing man. He is kind and gentle, but firm and decisive, all in one. Let me just close by telling you a personal story. See how I'm doing on time. Okay. About my personal experience gaining a witness of the power of God working through a prophet. President Monson used to say, the greatest force in the world today is the power of God as it works through man. That's the greatest force. It isn't politics or machine guns or opportunities to break the glass ceiling. The greatest force is to be able to turn to God and seek his power. Well, I was walking into the office one day. It was cold outside. It was January. I was supposed to have the book almost done. It wasn't done. It wasn't coming together. You get to a place as a writer where everything is like this and nothing is coming together like this. And it's a tough place to be. You always hit that. You usually get over it. But I'd been there for a while. And I'd been working and trying this and that, and nothing was really working to bring everything together. And I was discouraged. I was depressed. Now, some people will say to me, "Oh, I bet it was a great experience to write a biography of a prophet of God." And I look at them and I think to myself, are you out of your mind? It was such a responsibility to get it right, to tell it the way the Lord would want it told, to put forward that this was not just a man. This was a man of God. This was a prophet called before the beginning of this world, prepared in a home where there was no activity. He went to church alone and went through one experience after another, a bishop, stake president, mission president, called to the Quorum of the 12 at age 36. Okay, I'm walking into the office. I've got my computer over my arm. I've got a bunch of books. I've got my coat. I've got my keys. I'm bedraggled. And he's standing by the door. He loves to begin a morning meeting with top of the morning to you. So, of course, he looks at me and he says, "Top of the morning to you." And I looked at him and thought, yeah, right. And I smiled and same to you, President. He said, "How are you today?" And I said, thinking to myself, not good, looking at him and saying, "I'm fine. I'm just fine." And he said, "Well, that's great." And I went over and sat down at my desk and went to work. About an hour later, he came out of his office, walked past my desk and into the West boardroom. And he was gone for about an hour. Came out of the West boardroom, walked past my desk, stopped, put his hand on my shoulder, said, "Are you doing okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." He said, okay, patted me on the shoulder, walked into his office, turned right around and came back out, looked over at me and said, and I reached for my recorder, which I took with me everywhere because it was so much easier to work from that than to try and write things down. So I reached for my recorder, said, don't bring that. I thought, oh, okay. So I walked in his office and sat down at his perfectly clean desk and looked at him. And he just looked at me. I haven't talked about this in a long time. And he smiled and he just kept looking at me. And there was this. Now, I've been in that office 100 times or more, sitting in that chair. But I'd never seen him look like that. Because what I saw was the scripture that says, have you spiritually been born of God? Have you received his image in your countenance? And he had. I was looking at Thomas Monson and I was seeing the light and the countenance of the divine. And I was taken back by it. And then he said, so how are you really doing? Well, I knew what was on his schedule and I know how busy he was. And I wanted to appear like I was competent. And so I said, well, I'm fine. And he said, okay. And then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me again. Time passed. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't like I needed to say something. It was just this angelic experience of calm and peace that emanated from him. And he said, are you going to tell me how you're really doing? Well, I'd lied to him several times already that morning. I looked at him and I thought, oh, and then I started to cry. And I said, this is so hard. I've just tried so hard. I get up every morning at 4:00 and I write till 8. Then I come down here and I work in the files till 6. And then I go home and I write till 11. And then I go to bed and I get up at 4 and I write till 8. And I come down here and he goes, I get the picture. And I said, and it's just not sitting down. It's people think that the words will just appear because God's in charge. Well, you have to work for every word. You just have to pray that you get them right. And then the blessings come, but not until you've been locked in Liberty Jail a long time. And so I said to him, I don't know what else to do. I don't know if I should just keep getting up earlier, if I need to pray more. I don't know if I should keep going to the temple more. I don't know if my children are starving to death. They're eating hot dogs out of the microwave and forgetting that the fork is in there. You know, it's just, I don't know what to do. And he looked at me for a minute and I was thinking to myself, actually, I do know what to do. You call Elijah to come with a chariot of fire and bring me that manuscript. But I didn't say that, but I believed it. And he looked at me and he said, well, how can I help? I said, well, you've done so much and I just need to work harder. I just need to, and these eyes kept coming out. I. And he looked at me and he said, here's what I can do. And he went back to a scripture that was his favorite scripture. If you were to keep a record of every scripture President Monson ever used in every talk he ever gave that was written down, this scripture rises to the top as the number one because he loves it. It's in the Doctrine and Covenants. I will go before your face. That's the Lord speaking. I'm going to be out there in front. I'm taking the wind for you. I'll be on your right hand and on your left. You're never going to be alone. My spirit will be in your heart. President Monson felt that all the time. And my angels round about you to bear you up. And that day, maybe he was the angel. Well, that scripture was in my mind. One time I had asked President Monson, what's it like to be the president of the church? You know, you've been an apostle, you've sat in all the meetings, you've dedicated temples as a member of the quorum, and as in the first presidency, you've set apart missionaries, you've dedicated land for preaching of the gospel. You've done all these things. And now you're the president of the church. How is it different? And he just looked at me and he said, it's very lonely. I hated that. I didn't want him to be alone. And he said, but I am never alone, because I've always got the Lord on my right hand and on my left. He loves that. So he's talking to me. How can I help? I said, I don't know. And he said, well, I do. He said, here's what I can do. I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray right now for you. And then I'm going to kneel down every morning by the side of my bed, and I'm going to pray for you by name. And I'm going to ask the Lord to be on your right hand and on your left. Imagine saying that to a writer. And I just looked at him and he said, and we'll get this book done. Now, what else should we talk about? I walked out of his office with these mountains that had been on my shoulders of pain and grief lifted, gone. It was like he had said to Mount Olympus, move 10 feet to the right, get off her shoulders. Because that's what happened. I didn't feel it anymore. And I thought, whoa. I went home that night and Jeff and I were sitting and going over my list of names for the book. I didn't even have a name for the book. Of all things, you always have that first, and I didn't. And he read through the list. How about this? And he'd read this one and he'd look at me and I go, nah, that's not it. No, that's not it. We went down one page and then the other. They were all great ideas, but it wasn't it. And he looks at me and he goes, should we start again? Because maybe now that you've been thinking about it, it might come to us. I said, okay. So he started reading again. And all of a sudden, I wasn't hearing him. All of a sudden, I heard the name of the book is To the Rescue. And I thought, well, that's the epitome of Thomas S. Monson, To the Rescue. And I knew that because I'd had that experience myself. Now I understood with clarity what he was all about. To the rescue. And I looked at Jeff and I said, no, I've got the name of the book. I said, it's To the Rescue. And he looked at me and he said, it's not on the list. I said, I know, it just came to me. And I told him about that. Next morning, I went into the office and I just rushed into his office. He was sitting there and I said, I've got the name of the book. And he said, okay. I said, To the Rescue. And he looked at me for a minute. He looked up a little bit and then he said, yeah, that's the name of the book. And then I told him the experience I'd had. And then everything came together. I have seen firsthand what hundreds, I would say thousands of people experienced at the hand of Thomas S. Monson. I can bear witness that he is and was called of God. That he was a prophet of God on the earth today, and that he serves in the councils of heaven as we go forward with the restoration. He's a great man, but he's a greater prophet. We are blessed to have President Nelson, who is in that same groove, but with his own message. Again, a prophet of God leading us on the earth today. But the real leader of all that we do is Jesus Christ. I've witnessed that countenance. I know what it feels like. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.